Mic check. Yeah. Okay. All right. I suggest we're starting for today. So welcome back. Welcome to our lecture series, Ethics and Globalization. We're happy that you're here. Before we start off, some quick reminders. So as you might know, this talk again will be recorded. Second, we will have the talk of like about roughly an hour. Afterwards, we will have enough time for questions. So please note them down and ask them afterwards. And thirdly, some of you guys already asked for further literature concerning last week's talks. Yes, we will upload them, or I already did that. And but please remind, this is just further information for you guys, and this is not to be, or not necessarily to be the literature for the exam. This has to be assessed first and will be announced in due time. All right, that's about it. So today we are very happy to be able to welcome Krisztina Kis-Katos. Kis-Katos studied economics in Szeged. I hope I pronounced that not right. Szeged, according to Wikipedia, is the third biggest city in Hungary and the most sun-rich. In 2010, she received her PhD from Freiburg, again the most sun-rich city in Germany. And just in July, since July, she's professor of international economic policy in Göttingen. By no means sun-rich, but nonetheless, we congratulate her for the professorship. She works, her work is very empirical, as she says. She works on the impact of international trade on labor, with a focus on Indonesia, for example, but also analyzes the effects of corruption, terrorism, conflict. In a recent paper, she applies microeconometric data from Indonesia again to contribute to a more sophisticated view to such questions as how does globalization affect laborers all around the world. So I think today's talk will also focus on that, and we're looking forward, and we are very happy to have her here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The mute I on now. Okay, fine. Thank you for letting me know. The same way, if you have questions, please do exactly the same. Just let me know during the talk. So what I'm going to be looking at today is labor market effects of globalization. And the research question that I'm going to circling or trying to go around is going to be, does trade benefit workers in developing countries? So I have made my life quite a bit easier by saying trade, because globalization has so many dimensions, and I assume that you are looking at many dimensions, have been looking at many dimensions, and you are going to be looking at many dimensions. So it's about the free movement of goods, services, capital, investment, foreign direct and financial investment, workers and citizens and ideas and knowledge and so many other things. And economists very often just try to look at one of all these dimensions, and this one dimension is going to be the movement of goods around the world. So free movement of goods, basically trade. And we're not going to look at trade in services, so it's trade in goods. We are looking at workers, so at labor market effects of trade, and focusing mainly on developing countries, although I'm going to cheat a tiny little bit on this. You are going to see where. So you are sitting in a lecture series on ethics and globalization. So my first question is, why do we care? And I do very little on ethics myself, so I'm an empiricist, and I'm mainly trying to measure issues. So that's I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions, but that's my first question. What do you think? Why do we care? Do we care, and why do we care? So basically, you would have to make up your mind and just call in something into the floor. Thank you. Okay, so we think bad conditions, bad working conditions are somehow morally repugnant. There is some ethical, moral imperative that we are applying to this. Anything else?
I come from China, very small village. A lot of uneducated young people, they go to the big cities to do this kind of factory job. I mean, from their point of view, they are lucky. You can find a job in the city. So we don't think this is kind of, so I don't understand.
Thank you. I'm so happy to receive this answer very quickly. Moral imperatives are quite dangerous. Just give me a sec. Just give me an opportunity to make it louder. We are not going to argue on this. I just wanted to pick up the point. Your colleague was saying, you know, these girls may be just so lucky. It depends on what you are comparing it with. This may be their way out of poverty. This may be their way out of bone-breaking work on the fields. So you could come with other arguments, even from the West. You could say, yes, but as consumers, we do have actually a preference towards how our goods are being produced. So if I'm consuming a T-shirt, I would really like to know how the way it has been produced actually affects my valuation of it. Did you want to add something? Sorry for...
maybe we feel not so good about this kind of factory work because we thought we were over this.
We thought we were over this. Of course, in the West, you are over this. And the question is whether everyone is over this. But yes. Okay, so yeah, and I'm not going to really discuss this. So I'm going to take this just... So you still get a chance to say something, and then I think I'm going to... If it comes to this, so if it comes to really, and that's a very emblematic picture. So if you search for the word sweatshop online, that's one of the pictures that you are going to get among the first hits. Do you know what it is? It is an incident. It was an incident, a very clear incident in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. It was many factories, like many so-called sweatshops were operating in there and were selling to the Western market. So it's when you are thinking about safety standards, very often people have this in mind and say that's just not worth it. If you look, and now I'm cheating again because that's just a picture, people protesting against a different type of trade liberalization. It's not towards developing countries. That's liberalizing trade and services or harmonization across Western countries or across the Atlantic. But still, if you look at the titles on the graph, or not the graph, on the picture, you are going to see faire Arbeit, faire Löhne. So there is an idea about there have to be some fair standards globally around the world that we would have to somehow, again, from a moral perspective, we need to make sure that they are met. But as some of your colleagues said, that may be a luxury. Do you know what many economists answer to this type of arguments? They're very easily captured. They're very, very easily captured by interest groups. They are very easily captured by those who want to protect actually domestic industries and certain parts of our own, or for instance, own labor. So when you are trying to keep out southern workers from the western markets or northern markets, it's not really because you want to protect them and their health and safety. So, or at least it can be instrumentalized by those who have absolutely different goals. It was a very, very thin, that was my very, very thin attempt to somehow reflect upon ethics. I'm not going to reflect upon ethics in the rest of this talk. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to try to actually look at evidence, and I'm going to try to show you one way how economists go about this and how they try to read out of the data what does happen to labor when countries open up their markets to trade. For that, I'm going to have a very, very thin theory part. It's going to be one slide. So, but interestingly enough, this one slide already tells us a lot about what is important to know. And as you are mostly econ students, who is not econ from this room? Okay, almost. Fine. So be patient with me. So if you are absolutely lost in terms of terminology or in terms of methods, you would have to let me know, because then I'm sort of assuming that you are econ students, mostly. I'm going to try to be still comprehensible, but if I'm getting very weird, just let me know. So the first main argument comes from David Ricardo. Very old, extremely powerful. Tells you as soon as countries are different in their endowments, technologies, in anything basically, there is going to be a comparative advantage. It's not the same as an absolute advantage, and you have learned it, I hope. Please do this. Yeah, sure, I know what a comparative advantage is. We learn it in micro. Fine, thank you. So there is going to be a comparative advantage, and this comparative advantage is a reason for trade, and gives us, even in very, very complex models, it still gives us, in most of the models, not in all of them, but in most of the models, gives us the result that on average, when countries start trading, there are gains from trade. So on average, or as a whole, a country is going to benefit when it starts trading. That's basically the Ricardian argument. There is going to be specialization. When two countries start to trade with each other, there is going to be some specialization, and there are going to be benefits from it. By now, there is a new economic or a new trade theory that tells you additional reasons for that can arise, or additional gains from trade through agglomeration, increasing returns to scale. For this argument, you don't need all these points. So there is some specialization that is beneficial. There is a second argument, again, super classic and very relevant in economics, the so-called Stolper-Samuelson theorem. How many of you have heard about that one? Those of you who have done international economics, I assume. So what does the theorem tell you is basically it looks at what happens in a country that is opening up to trade, and it tells you there are going to be very strong distributional consequences. So although there is on average a gain from trade to the country as a whole, there are going to be distributional issues, and that based on this argument, it's a very, very powerful argument at the time, and this is one of the few arguments in economics where you need a model to believe it. So you have to look at the model first, because it doesn't sound entirely intuitive when you hear it the first time. So the referees, when they have seen this paper submitted in the 1940s, at the beginning didn't believe the paper. They didn't believe the argument. And the argument goes, if there is specialization because of opening up to trade, or relative specialization, the owners of different factors are going to be differently affected by trade. The owners of factors that are relatively abundant within the country are going to be the winners. How comes? What's the argument? The owners of a factor, it sounds super technical, the owners of a factor that is relatively abundant in the country. Let's translate it to normal talk. What is the factor that is relatively abundant in a developing country? What are labor? Usually we are not putting this argument in terms of labor versus capital, we are putting this argument in terms of high versus low-skilled labor. So that's how it's recast very often in the development discussion. So if you think that there are two different factors of production, high and low-skilled labor, which one is abundant in a developing country? Unskilled labor. So the expectation is that if this country starts to trade, it's going to specialize a bit more in the production of the good that is using unskilled labor more intensively. Now translate it to normal talk. What does it mean? What type of production is the developing country going to be specializing in? What are they going to produce? Labor-intensive products. What are labor-intensive products? Textiles, for instance. So the garment industry would have to expand, and other labor-intensive industries would have to expand. Others would have to contract. By that, the expectation is that unskilled labor actually would have to benefit from it and would have to gain in terms of wages, even in terms of real wages. So although there are price adjustments in the economy, the Stolper-Samuelson theorem shows you that even in real terms, there are relatively abundant factors, so unskilled labor is going to benefit. It's a very, very powerful argument from a development economics perspective, because it tells you that if it's true, if that's what you are going to observe, then developing countries, as soon as they're globalizing more and more, they are going to get not only richer, but actually the poorest are going to benefit. So the distributional effects are going to be beneficial for them. There is also another half of this argument, which is a bit costlier to us, to the West, which is our, if we are thinking about unskilled labor and high-skilled labor, which is a relatively less abundant factor. Low-skilled labor and unskilled labor would be among the losers of trade in this model. So this model would predict losses to workers in northern countries, which we have been also seeing lately. So that's still, the model will tell you that there are gains on average. So if the country manages to compensate those workers who are losing out, it would be peachy. Countries do not manage to do that, or at least that's what we have seen. Not all countries manage to do that. What this argument requires, even for a developing country, are very flexible markets, because what this model assumes is that people are basically switching from sector to sector. As soon as the demand for unskill-intensive products rises, people are going to go to the other sector to work very quickly, and the quicker the adjustment, the less costs are to workers. In reality, when we start measuring the effects, and all the studies that started to measure the effects of trade liberalization in developing countries, what they see, yeah, markets do have frictions, mostly. So basically, we may be not in a fully flexible world where factors are moving between sectors very quickly. Instead, it may be that in a very short run, we are much better if we are taking a Ricardo Weiner type of model where if you don't know the talk, just forget it. But if you have had this type of models already in international economics, then it may make sense to you. So you take a Ricardo Weiner type of model where a factor is actually sector specific. So where a factor is not going to move very quickly out of the sector. So a worker is going to stay in the declining industry, although the industry is declining, and the worker is going to stay there for a while. If that's the world we believe in, then actually it does matter when a country, a developing country, starts opening up to trade. It does matter where did it start from. So how was the original protection organized? So which sectors were protected? Because those sectors are going to lose out in the short run, even in the long run, but they are going to lose. And the workers in those sectors, if they are not quick enough to move out, are also going to lose. And that's basically what the first strand of empirical studies that have been performed beginning of 2000s, mostly on Latin American countries, that's what they were finding. They looked at industries and they looked at what happened in countries, in developing countries, in Colombia, in Brazil, in developing countries, in Mexico, that were opening up to trade, and what they found is actually declining wages for workers. So that was the first finding that these studies showed. And very quickly, it also turned out because especially labor-intensive sectors used to have very high levels of protection in these countries. So when protection levels were going down, workers were actually losing out. So in the short run, when there are frictions to adjustment, that can be also costly to workers. It doesn't mean that in the long run there may not be benefits, but for that, workers have to adjust. What I'm going to show you today is a different strand of the literature, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of empirical papers on that, and if there is enough time, I'm also going to present some results of our papers, like from analysis that I have been working on with other people. And this strand of literature takes a different approach. It doesn't look at sectors, and it doesn't look at which sectors were affected by trade liberalization, and how were the workers who were working in those sectors affected, but rather it looks at regional effects of trade. It looks at different regions that have different original composition of their economies, and how were these regions, and how were workers and households and the poor in these regions affected when the country opened up to trade. And so I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples of this literature. So I'm going to look at local labor market effects of trade. For that, I'm going to introduce a very basic framework to you, or a general framework, and I would argue that all studies use this. I'm going to show you 3 formulas, maybe 4. I think 1, 2, 3. I'm going to show you 3 formulas. That's the first one. And what I'm basically trying to do is to put all empirical studies, or to show you a basis for all empirical studies that are being written in this literature. I'm going to give you the slides as well, I think. So you get the slides before you start copying a lot. You don't have to, but feel free to copy still. So it's up to you. So what I want to show you, that what this slide shows you is basically how do we measure regional exposure to trade liberalization? What's the problem if you want to look at regional exposure to trade liberalization? First of all, what is trade liberalization? There is the word tariff. So what does trade liberalization mean when a developing country liberalizes trade? What does it do? It lowers the tariffs on what? On imported goods. So that's how we measure mostly trade liberalization, is the lowering of tariffs on imported goods. What happens because of the lowering of tariffs on imported goods immediately? What happens to prices? If you lower tariffs on imported goods, what is going to happen to prices on those goods? Exactly. They are going to go down. So those goods are becoming relatively cheaper. That's going to change consumption decisions, but also going to change production decisions. Now, the difficulty with this is, who is lowering the tariffs? Is it a region? Not at all, right? Who is lowering the tariffs? The state, the country. So how is it done? There are very specific product categories, a line, 10 digits harmonized system, HS code, where the tariff has been 25% and now it's been lowered to 10%. But we want to see how much are regions affected by this. So what we have to do, we have to take all these tariff lines and these changes in tariffs, and we have to figure how important all this is for a regional economy. How do we do that? We take tariffs in a sector S in a year T, and we reweight them. We reweight them to end up with a tariff in region K in year T. How do you reweight it? By saying, let's say there is a 10% tariff on footwear. How important is footwear in the local economy? How would you measure how important it is in the local economy? You could measure it different ways. We are going to use one way of measurement, but how would you measure how important is footwear in the local economy? What could you say? How important is footwear in the economy of Bayreuth? Most likely it's absolutely unimportant, but what would you do?
Well, you could look at the numbers of imports or exports and compare them.
You could look at import and export flows. Yes, regionally you wouldn't have that. You don't know how much a region imports or exports. Good idea, but you couldn't do that. So in reality. Quantity of money made by the tariff. Forget it. You are thinking, and that's good. But forget the tariff. How important is footwear is irrelevant of the tariff. How important is footwear? You could look at the demand. So how many people buy footwear as compared to the whole. But in most regions, footwear is going to be more or less the same relevance. So from a consumption perspective, you could weight tariffs by consumption shares. But that's not what really drives local economy. What drives local economy? How much is produced? That's something. So we use that also as a measure. So the value of production in the sector of footwear divided by the total value of production in the region. Or how many people are working there? We are looking at the labor market. So why not look at how many people does footwear industry employ? So that's the share. Q is, let's say, it's number of people who are working in sector S, which is the footwear, in region K, divided by the number of people who work totally. QK is then the number of people who work in that region as a total. So you are taking the labor share of this sector and saying 10% of all people are working in footwear. So for the region where 10% of people are working in footwear, reductions on tariffs on this good is going to be less important than for a region where 50% of everyone, or of the workers are working on footwear, in the footwear sector. So basically by doing that, you are reweighting tariffs by the relative importance of the sectors in terms of their labor inputs. And that's what most of the studies are doing. So I'm going to walk you through a number of studies. All of them are regionalizing tariffs by saying, okay, how important is this actually in the production of the local economy? By that, you end up with regional tariff measures. There is one additional important element. You take this in a T0. So you take it in a year before your reforms started. Because after the reforms go on, there is going to be some structural adjustment, most likely. It's induced by the tariff reforms. It's induced by trade liberalization. You don't want to pick that up. So you just go back to the initial conditions. You say, how important was the footwear sector initially in the local economy? And you use that as a weight for what is going to come. That was the first formula. There is a second, and the second is basically just a regression. So what people do then, they are looking at changes in all socioeconomic conditions at the district level. Y could be wages, poverty rates, employment, the share of workers, formalization. You could look at many different labor market or socioeconomic outcomes, and they are relating it to changes in tariffs, which are not changes in tariffs, but the regional exposure. So tariffs weighted by their regional importance. And so basically, this relationship between the two variables is going to be what we are interested in. What happens when tariffs go down? And this delta tariff is always going down because we look at episodes of trade liberalization. So what happens when tariffs go down? Do wages go up or down? Does employment go up or down? And so on. Additionally, there is a possibility to control for many things, to control for initial conditions. That's also what we are doing in our papers. So, because districts could be on a different trajectory, development trajectory. You somehow want to pick that up. Additionally, what most papers control for is some regional effects, some macro-region effects. So if I'm looking at 300, 250 Indonesian regions, I say, okay, but they belong to larger islands, macro-regions. Let's pick up the shocks that these macro-regions are receiving year by year, and let's differentiate. So basically, all these analyses look at within variation within a macro-region. This could be a state, this could be an island. For me, it's an island. So They're also using some region year fixed effects on the top. But basically that's the setup. And now I wrote down everything in the first difference specification. So basically, how do outcomes change when tariffs change? But you could also look at, estimate the whole thing with a fixed effects model. Looking at you, you did have econometrics. Fixed effects models versus first difference specifications. If not, we are looking at changes. Changes on the one hand side, on the other. And we are looking how these changes go together. So I'm just trying to find the level of complexity that's still not too much and still understandable. There's a third ingredient in the whole story. These tariff reductions that we are looking at in developing countries, there has to be some exogeneity to them. If tariff reductions are just following what's happening anyway in the country, if they are following some political powers, some lobbying, we are going to pick that up. We are not going to pick up the effects of trade liberalization itself. So what all these studies look at are sudden trade liberalization episodes, either because of countries were entering the WTO, 94, at the formation, or because the countries were forced by were undergoing some IMF scheme that forced them to actually open up their trading regimes, also a very sudden change. And what usually these papers use as an argument, and I just took it from ours, is basically, if you look at tariff changes, each dot is a sector. Like footwear is somewhere in there, it's a dot. What you see on the vertical axis is the change of tariffs. So by how much did tariffs decline? 10%, 20%, 30, 40, not percentage points. On the horizontal axis, you have the tariff levels. Where did tariffs start? And what you see here, when tariffs started very high, they were slashed very strongly. When tariffs started middle, they were slashed middle. When tariffs started very low, of course, the change was very small. So you basically have an across-the-board reduction in tariffs across all sectors. And this is very important because this gives you some exogenous variation. The original initial level of protection, so which sectors were protected in that country, it's not exogenous at all. So of course it's a result of the local political economy, distribution of power, distribution of assets, many things. But when tariff reforms kicked in, there is usually an across-the-board shock to the economy. And we are going to utilize this across-the-board shock, basically. And so this type of graphs is always an element, a third element in the empirical setup. So you have to measure tariffs. It's a measurement issue. You have to run a regression. And additionally, you have to make sure that these changes in tariffs are somehow not endogenously formed. Okay, now what I want to do right now is to walk you through a couple of papers and to show you some results from different papers looking at different countries and the experience of different countries. And I'm going to do that using a couple of graphs, where graphs were available, and a couple of tables, where tables were available. So what we always are going to look at is basically just this beta coefficient. So what did happen to a labor market outcome when tariffs went down? A positive beta, what would that mean? Tariffs went down. So the labor market outcome, whatever I'm measuring, let's say wages, I'm looking at wages. If a beta coefficient is positive, what would that mean? What happened to wages? They also went down. So basically positive coefficients here in this type of setup show you some wage increases, employment increases, and so on. Negative coefficients show you reductions. The other way around, sorry. So decreases. So positive coefficients show you decreases of wages, decreases of employment, negative coefficients. You have to flip them, basically, whenever you see any. So the first experience we are looking at is India. India had a major deregulation and trade liberalization that started 1991, was centrally instituted and was really a major policy change. Tariffs were slashed big time from about 100 on average to about 20% over in the course of a couple of years. And the first empirical paper that was looking at the effects of trade liberalization on such development outcomes in a regional setting, so local labor markets. It was a young doctoral student in the US. Her name is Petya Topalova. By now she's at the IMF. And she was basically the first person ever doing this in this setup. And by now, lots of people have used the same setup to analyze different labor market outcomes. Also, much, how to put it, academic superstars as well. But she was the first one. The results, if you're looking at, so now I'm going to show you some beta coefficients. So I'm basically showing you estimation results always on that one beta. So what happens when tariffs go down? And I just took one table out of the many in her paper, two tables actually, that's the one. So that's the first paper, first table out of her paper, and it looks at what happens when tariffs go down. The first outcome is wholesale price index. It goes down as well. What does it mean? Cutting tariffs reduces prices. That's what you always expect, that actually the channel through which everything acts is actually a price channel. A second, real wages per worker are declining. So if you expect somehow to see wage increases, immediate wage increases in a developing country, India is a labor-abundant developing country, that's something that you don't see. So that's where it starts beginning interesting, because you start, okay, why not? So what else could be at work? What you also see is production sector premium, so by how much do production sector workers earn more than non-production sector workers, also decreasing. So the production sector is also not benefiting from it. Or the workers in the production sector are not benefiting from this tariff liberalization. Agricultural wages are declining. People didn't really know what to do with this. So her explanation of why there are actually such bad effects is an ingenious one. What she did, she said, okay, let's split this effect into two. Let's distinguish between districts. The whole thing is at the level of districts, Indian districts. Let's split the effects for districts that have very tight labor market laws, that have very strict regulation, who can start, who can enter and exit different occupations. So the labor laws make the movement of people out and into occupation very, very hard. And India, you can imagine, is a country where there is a lot of regulations on labor. That makes it, at times, very hard to switch or to hire new people. And what you see is basically that if you look at this, these are two parts of the coefficient. The upper part is for those regions where labor laws are inflexible. And the two things together, A plus B, is for those regions where labor laws are flexible. So what you see is, for highly regulated districts, you see, and now the outcome is a poverty rate, you see an increase in the poverty rate with tariff reductions, because you have to flip it still. So basically the poverty rate goes up in those districts that have very tightly regulated labor markets. In those districts that have relatively lax labor market regulation, there is no change. So there is no difference. So basically, she finds a differential effect, and she manages to bring it back to how hard it is to enter new occupations, to exit, to hire, fire people. So if you expect trade to be beneficial, people have to be able to adjust. If people are not able to adjust in the labor market, what you see is basically a Ricardo-Weiner type of model, where laborers are laborers, workers are sector-specific, and they are going to lose out if their sector is losing protection. So, and that's what she was finding, basically, that in India, those sectors were more highly protected that were more labor-intensive. And so those regions that used that were producing more labor-intensive goods were also more protected. So in the very short run, what you see is, especially if regulation is very tight and if people cannot leave there or cannot start a new occupation, you see actual losses to people, and losses in terms of poverty. So it seems to be costly. So India's experience has shown immediately after trade liberalization, if people cannot move, it's not going to be very helpful. A second example is on Brazil. Brian Kovac, also an American doctoral student. Some doctoral students are into this type of, or used to be into this type of work. By now he's also a very successful professor, so that was obviously a way to success. He looked at Brazil's trade liberalization episode, also in the 90s. What you see here now is basically a visual argument what's going on. On the left-hand side, you have regional level changes in tariffs. The very dark is very little changes in tariffs. The very light is very large changes in tariffs. So if you see, for instance, that's the Amazon. That's the Amazon biome, basically, up there. There is very little changes in tariffs in the Amazon biome. Why? Because there is almost no production, and the production that was there is not in sectors that were heavily protected, because there is just almost no manufacturing in the middle of the Amazonia. So here you don't see large tariff reductions. You see large exposure, regional exposure to tariff reductions in the middle and then on the eastern coast. Now what he's doing is always just looking at within state variation. So states are marked by thick lines. So he's always comparing districts with larger and smaller exposure to tariff reductions within a same state. So by that, differences like this would be factored out in a sense. So this is a completely different economy in the Amazon, of course. So what he's comparing is just those different districts within a region. And he's connecting it to regional wage changes. And there again, so the dark was small tariff reductions, and on the other side, on the right-hand side, dark is wage increases. And the very, very light colors are wage decline. And what I cannot see, and I don't know whether you see it, but what statistical analysis clearly shows is actually that there is a correlation between the distribution of these two graphs. So there's a positive correlation between the two. So where the one is lighter, the other is more likely to be lighter within a state. I cannot see that, but my eyes are not the same as a statistical program. So I was staring at it for a while, and I don't see the correlation by plain eyesight. But that's what's basically going on. You are looking at whether within a state, those districts that are lighter on the one hand side are also statistically lighter on the other. Your eyes are not statistical either. That's very consoling for me, because I haven't seen that as well either. If you look at this, at the coefficients, so basically the dependent variable is wages, changes in wages, explanatory variable is changes in tariffs. And as soon as you use state fixed effects, it's always the second, fourth, sixth, eighth column, you see stars, so you see significant correlations. So basically when tariffs go down, wages go down. So he finds, again, negative wage effects to workers in the short run in districts. And he says that's exactly because the adjustment costs are being borne here again for Brazil, because especially labor-intensive sectors were very strongly protected. When they are losing protection, workers are actually bearing this. Now you could say, yeah, so basically the whole argument is refuted, but it's not as easy as that. So at the end, what you can say is that the whole thing is very much context dependent. In a different paper with a co-author, he also looks at what happens to skill premia. Skill premia is by how much do better educated people earn more than low educated people. If you still have Stolper-Samuelson arguments in your mind, what would happen to skill premia in a developing country? Let's think about it. Skill premia, so that's by how much do better educated people earn more than low educated. So the very classical expectation by a Stolper-Samuelson type of argument is that who is going to benefit? Those who are many. Who are many? The unskilled. So what's going to happen to the skill premium? It should decrease, right? What does he find? He finds a decreasing skill premium. So although there is a fall in wages, at the same time, he also finds the skill premium is decreasing. So do we refute the economic model? Not really. We just see that the reality is quite a bit more complicated than we would have expected. Just to make the picture a bit more complex. Vietnam, a different type of story. Until now, we have looked at India and at Brazil, and at what happens to the country when it reduces import tariffs. It reduces protection, basically, on those industries that are producing those goods. So import tariffs make goods. If they reduce, those goods get cheaper. Those industries that were producing these goods are on the losing side. In Vietnam, it's a different type of policy experiment. Vietnam undersigned a bilateral trade agreement with the US, basically gaining access to the large US-American market. It happened after 2001. As you see here in the graph, Vietnam started to trade heavily with the US, started to export. That's billions of USD, and that's value of Vietnamese export to the US. So before we were looking at what happens if these countries get import competition, and we were measuring, yeah, it's costly. Now we are looking at what happens since these countries are also gaining market access. And what you see is that they start exporting. The share of United States in Vietnam's exports also increased. Now he's looking at poverty, and you have positive coefficients. So in those regions that had an economy that was more exposed to the US tariff cuts, tariffs went down, poverty went down very strongly. So what you see, that regions benefited from the market access, from the access to large markets. So now it's not competition from the outside coming, but gaining access to the large market, which was very beneficial to reductions in poverty. When you are globalizing as a developing country, which thing happens to you? Are you inviting import competition, or are you gaining access to a foreign market? Which one happens to you? What do you think? Most likely both, very often. So on the one hand side, you are actually inviting much more competition. On the other hand, you are actually gaining access to markets. One could be costly at the short term, the other could be extremely helpful to reduce poverty. Depends on what we are measuring. What are the results that we find? The last point, again, it's a graph from a different paper of his, that's Brian McCaig, actually. What he also finds is that those regions that were more affected by tariff reductions reduced. On the vertical axis, you have the share of people working in household enterprises, so basically working at home in tiny scale businesses. They reduced as well. So in those regions that were affected by, or that benefited from market access to the US, what happened is people stopped working at home. What happened is people started to work in formal sectors, which is good for them, most likely, because home, the scale of production is tiny, profits are tiny. If they become workers, if they become employees, that's actually a way to improve their quality of life. At the same time, it's a way to improve the productivity of a country. The last example, I'm just going to skim it, and I was just basically introducing it by stealth. It's not a developing country, it's the US. But there is also a very well-known empirical paper looking at the effects of trade with China, so the effects on the local labor markets, by Otto Dorn Hansen, 2013. That was the first paper that was looking at local labor market effects of Chinese competition. And I'm not showing you all the results, I'm just showing you one graph, which shows you, and that's not an empirical test, it's just the motivation, where you see very quick decline in manufacturing employment at the same time as you see a steep increase in trade with China. And so it's over districts. So basically, those the import penetration ratio is increasing, and in those districts where competition with China in the production sector was more important, these were the ones that were losing jobs, shedding very strongly jobs in the manufacturing sector. So not surprising that that was workers, yeah, I know. It was part of the very famous election campaign. Now I still have a little bit of time to actually talk about I was doing. Give me 15 minutes? Okay. So I was looking at Indonesia in a couple of different papers. Been there, fantastic country, additionally very good for an economist because it's very large. It's the 4th largest country on earth, although you don't think a lot about Indonesia, I would assume, mostly. It's very diverse. There is a lot of data, so it's also very interesting to analyze. It's an ideotypical labor-intensive country, or unskilled labor-intensive country, as you would imagine it. And it's large enough to actually see some regionalized effects of trade. What we are looking at is a trade liberalization episode in the 90s. 2 things happened. First, we are looking from 93 to 2002. First, there was a WTO accession, and Indonesia was a forming member. So they were reducing tariffs because after the Uruguay round. And the second thing that happened, there was in the middle a Southeast Asian crisis, and we have to do a lot of work to make sure that it's not the Southeast Asian crisis that is actually driving our results. I'm going to spare you on that part. But after that, the IMF came in, and the IMF pushed through a second wave of trade liberalization. And what we are looking at is basically 2 waves of trade liberalization and what happened in Indonesia to the labor markets. We do have some descriptive evidence that tells us that there were improvements in the labor market in the 90s. Wages increased, working conditions improved, wage inequality reduced. There are also very interesting empirical papers that look at what happened to firms. So they look at firm data and identify that import tariff reductions, the tariff reductions on imports, they actually acted through 2 channels. First, to what you are producing as a firm. Second, to what you are buying as inputs. And so they were distinguishing between these 2 channels, saying that what you are producing, that's competition. So when the prices on your final good decrease, you are experiencing much more competitive pressure as a firm. When prices on your inputs decrease, something else happens. You're getting inputs cheaper. So you are becoming more productive, efficient very quickly. And these 2 effects, what these papers were showing, that actually this competition-inducing effect and from the output side, it didn't bother firms that much. At the same time, firms benefited a big time from the input tariff reductions. So what we have is basically strong evidence that beneficial effects of tariff reductions that come through the input side were actually overweighing in Indonesia. And so that's what we are taking and bringing it to the data, but now not on firms, but on labor markets, on local poverty, and so on, and looking at, okay, if we are now distinguishing between output and input tariffs, so tariffs that are important for the local economy because of the production, and tariffs that are important for a local economy because of what local firms use as inputs. And if you distinguish between these 2 channels, what happens? I'm sparing you the second formula. The first one was how to regionalize output tariffs. The second one is how to regionalize input tariffs. What you have to do, without explaining it to you because the time is short, but what you have to do, you have to reweight tariffs now by looking at what types of inputs do different sectors use as outputs. So basically you say, okay, now tariffs on leather are important in my region because footwear firms are buying leather. And because of that, that's going to be beneficial to the footwear firms. And then you are still taking the share of the footwear as industry in the local production. So it's basically just adding one additional step on it, saying now it's not tariffs on footwear that we are looking at, it's tariffs on leather and on machines and on fat and whatever else, shoelaces, so textiles, whatever else the footwear industry is using. And so we are distinguishing between these two. These are the output tariff reductions in Indonesian regions, these are the input tariff reductions. What you see is that there is enough variation across districts to differentiate between output and input tariffs. And what we see is, I'm going to present you 3 results. I think I'm still quite okay on time, yes. The first thing is, for us, wherever we do our analysis, this input tariff channel seems to be very important, and the more important than the others, which is maybe not so surprising because that was also what papers found on firms, that firms are actually benefiting from cheaper inputs, but by more than what they are losing when the prices of their products are actually decreasing. And the same thing we are also finding in terms of regional labor markets. When we are looking at poverty, for instance, basically what output tariffs stand for, they stand for more competition in the local labor market. What input tariffs stand for, they stand for firms becoming more efficient because prices for inputs went down. What you see is that this thing, positive correlation, means reduces poverty. The other thing is actually slightly poverty increasing. If you add up the 2 things, in sum, the improvements still overweigh. So basically what we find is that the beneficial effects to the local labor markets that come from local firms becoming more productive because they are able to trade actually overweigh. So it's, as a total, the country is opening up its markets, and those regions where production is such that tariffs on the goods that were that are regionally produced are declining, in those regions poverty is decreasing by more. So basically, it's a mapping between what is good for firms, seems to be also good for poverty. How comes? It could be a macro type of argument. It's additional demand being generated, that households, even those who are not working in the formal sector, still benefit from. It could be that the additional demand is in terms of household services and helping out in other families and so on. So it's a derivative demand, but still, what you see is in total a reduction in poverty. Additionally, we looked at wages, we looked at what happens to to firms at the regional level. I just want to show you one additional result which we are working on right now and which I find very interesting, because we have seen positive work creation. So we have seen an increase in work participation in those regions that were affected by input tariff reductions. So basically in those regions where firms are getting more productive and getting benefits out of from trade, in those regions work is being created. So more people work. And then someone asked us, should we split it up? And we split it up by male and female work, and it turned out it's not more work, it's more female work. So there is a clear difference between who is actually reacting to this on the extensive margin, so who starts working. And here in the Indonesian case, it was females starting working, so that this correlation with the input tariff is not there for males, is there for females in different lower education categories. And what could be behind it is actually, if you look at what sectors were more affected by tariff reductions here, that's just major sectors, textiles were, for instance, very strongly affected by tariff reductions. They are also very female labor intensive. So if there is some different, there is certainly different relative shares of females working in different sectors. If those sectors benefit more strongly that are actually more female labor intensive, it may also mean that actually females are going to be the ones who are going to adjust in terms of labor supply. If there is some labor market segregation. So what this result shows you that there must be some labor market segregation by gender. And the very last result we were looking at, because we found it really cute, is marriage. You see delayed marriage being related to input tariff reductions. So basically, local economies benefit and firms and females start working relatively more. So actually no, maybe because female work is relatively stable and even declining slightly. But in those regions that were more affected, it's declining less, or females still start working more. And what you see is a decline in the share of ever married in the younger ages, 20-29 for females, 30-39 for males. So what you see is a delay in marriage as a social outcome. And that's something that we find very interesting, and you're looking at it, and this effect seems to be different for different types of regions. So Indonesia, again, is very vast and very diverse. So some regions are very, although every region is religious, but the strictness of religious norms is different, and we are trying to tease out whether this relationship is actually somehow related to the strictness of religious norms at the local level. And it seems to be that actually marriage rates are especially declining there where religiosity is not very strict and very strong. So basically, that cultural norms are counteracting what globalization is actually doing here. So that was basically it, what I wanted to show you. And we can discuss a lot. I didn't put up a conclusion. So I just put up an empty slide. What should we conclude from all of this? Is there anything we can actually conclude from all of this? So I'm looking forward to anything you can actually contribute. It's late and you are sleepy, I know, but if you still have something to say, I'm very happy about it.
I have two questions, and the first one is, how would you explain the difference between Brazil and India to trade liberalization compared to Vietnam? Would you only pin it down to to rigid labor markets, or are there other factors? And second,
Can you just stop, because I'm very bad at remembering questions. So I'm coming back to your second question. I'm very happy to come back to your second question. Take it one by one. The first question is, what would you put down the difference between India, Brazil, where we have seen wages declining, versus Vietnam, where we have actually seen poverty declining? What could it be? That's really the puzzle. And you don't remember that much, I assume, from this presentation. But if you remember anything that I said and you have an inkling on this one, I actually give it back to you. I'm happy to answer it. It's not that I don't want to answer it, but maybe someone still remembers what my tentative point was on this, actually.
I think you said that the regions have problems with adjusting to globalization, so the workers get stuck in their section, and then the section...
Sector?
Yeah, right. Sector declines, and then the workers get poorer.
So basically, if the workers cannot switch quickly enough, then in the short run, you are going to measure these negative effects. That's an expectation. That's something that you could really expect out from it. How was Vietnam different? What were we looking at? It was a different. I'm cheating. It was a different kind of policy experiment, really, and I think it explains most likely something. So what you are measuring there, and I was quick about this, but you're absolutely right. What we were measuring there is by how much did the US cut tariffs with respect to the different Vietnamese sectors. So we weren't measuring by how much did Vietnam reduce its own protection against its own sectors, but rather by how much did the US reduce protection against Vietnamese sectors. So in a sense, there you have a very clean argument exporting yourself out of poverty, which is a pretty straightforward one. So if you measure by how much more can you export, if you somehow come up with a measure, how much more access do you gain to a Western market, it's more likely, so it's not that surprising that you find beneficial effects. It doesn't mean that losing of import protection should always be costly, and that you should always be able to measure these costly effects. But under which conditions do you expect to measure costly effects is actually if you are measuring it very short run, and if people are basically stuck in the sectors that are losing protection. You wanted to add something?
But the fact that in Vietnam is more about accessing the US market and that slashing about that, and as that is, it would have probably been the same, if not better, if tariff of Vietnam had been stayed up?
So basically you say that if Vietnam was protecting its own market and the US was giving them access...
It's more about being able to access a big foreign market and actually being able to export and actually...
So although it was, you're absolutely right, so although it was a bilateral trade agreement, it's not like the US started exporting to Vietnam big time. It was rather Vietnam, so there was most likely something going on, but it was very unequal in that sense. So Vietnam was starting to export to the US a lot.
The case of China is even more interesting because China did resist heavily to reducing its own tariff. I mean, it still has quite high tariff, and the effect...
Yeah, but the China also, okay, you say it's interesting in China, China still has quite high tariff, but they had to reduce very strongly at WTO accession.
Yeah,
So
they're still much higher, and they had the most positive effect on, I mean, their growth is unparalleled, and they're famous for that. And
So basically, what we are arguing for is really, we are in a sense arguing for protectionism. In a sense, we are saying getting access to foreign markets is good, losing protection is going to be costly in the short run. Now, put this to the Indonesia story, or bring this to the Indonesia story, which is actually surprising in that sense.
Indonesia was a net, I mean, I think that from what I remember with Indonesia doesn't have much natural resources.
Indonesia has a lot of natural resources. Papua, so they are a big natural resource exporter, actually.
Didn't know that.
Okay, no, that doesn't matter.
If it was about the reduction of tariff on imports, could be explained well, but
The reduction of tariffs on imports, but there we were doing a trick. Do you remember the trick? We're basically... We are looking at input tariffs. What we were finding that the output tariffs do not overweigh. So in a sense, we were splitting it up. Because when you are cutting tariffs, you're not only cutting tariffs on what you produce, but at the same time, you're also cutting tariffs on intermediates. And we were taking these two, so basically differentiating. So if you take the Indian paper, the Brazil paper, they do not do this. So you don't know what happens, so whether there is, but you see the total effect, and the total effect is not good. What we see is basically if you start differentiating it, then what you may be losing from the increasing competition, it's actually overweight, but what we are gaining. And that's, when talking to policymakers, what they want basically is to keep tariffs on intermediate good products that are important for us low, at the same time keep tariffs on final goods high. That's just a very difficult feat to achieve. So I think the difficult, or like the interesting thing about this is, Indonesia was slashing tariffs across the board, and they came out better of it, although it wasn't like a policy intent to, or not like a policy, of course the policy intent is always somehow to generate some beneficial effects over the long term, but as compared to other countries, they came actually out relatively good of it. But interestingly, I'm still coming back to you, so I didn't forget you, but it just takes a while. Interestingly, in the 2000s, they actually started to introduce a lot of additional protectionist measures. And by now there is WTO, so it's not so easy to do that. So how do you do that? You introduce some additional regulations, all those things that are called NTBs, non-tariff barriers. Start making additional requirements on licensing. It was always complicated in Indonesia, so import licensing is actually a complicated thing. But all these additional non-tariff barriers that are actually going to try to substitute for tariff barriers. I'm coming to you, I still owe him a question. So, oh, okay, oh, fine. Fine. It's very, okay. Okay, so I'm going to make it first louder. How do you account for NTBs? It's hard to account for them, actually. So you can somehow pick them up, and some of the papers, what they're doing, they're trying to figure whether during the reduction of tariff barriers, whether there was also a relative reduction in NTBs. And for instance, for India's case, Topalova is arguing that they were going sort of along. So the two things were, both of them were reducing. But there are also some papers that show that actually NTBs were substituting after a while. So why does it matter? because you can under or overestimate effects if that's true. So if NTBs go to the same direction, then you are overestimating the effects of tariff liberalization, because actually you are measuring the combined effect of tariff plus NTB liberalization. If it goes the other direction, so if they are substituting, you are not going to find enough tariff effects because the others were actually substituting for them. Now, what most likely is happening actually that NTB substitution takes a while. So these tariff reforms were quite sudden. There was a decision, it was made from year to the second to the third very quickly. NTB regulation is going to creep in after a while. So in a sense, if you're just measuring relatively short-run effects, you may not find a very large bias, but over time, NTBs do matter. So Indonesia was very prolific at setting up new trade barriers, blacklists for foreign investment, licensing requirements for importers that make the life of importers very hard, local content requirements. It's hard to put a number on them. So economists used to do that, but in a very aggregated way, so calculating effective rates of protection. But by now, I think the empirical literature is going to move also a bit towards measuring much more finely what are these NTBs and how do they matter and how much they matter and what are the costs actually. I think it's a very interesting question to look at. What are the costs or benefits? To whom do the benefits accrue? It's distribution. So it's basically distributional issues. So there are going to be some benefits as well as some costs. And if you learn international political economy, I don't know. No? Okay, fine. I just wanted to ask. So if you, I'm just going to make an argument from international political economy, is that costs are very often spread to consumers, for instance. So costs are spread among a large share of population. Benefits are very concentrated. So if an industry manages to keep tariffs high, those firms are going to profit a lot. So there is a political reason for lobbying if the rest loses a bit, but a couple benefit a lot. There's a very high incentive to put enough effort into actually lobbying for that regulation, which is what's happening, I think, all the time. So even if you think that on average there should be some benefits through liberalization, those groups that are going to lose from it are going to be very vocal and very strong about opposing it. And so since the average person is benefiting but a bit, she won't care that much.
If you open trade, consumption will maximize, and that's what we saw in the paper. I mean, we saw wages go up, particularly in Indonesia, and so consumption go up, etc. But this is a little tangent maybe to your argument, but it is going to be, there are long-term studies about wages and growth, because is it going to be good for, because if you specialize in low-skilled production, it can be a problem. That's not how historically countries develop. I mean, you can be stuck there for decades.
So basically the question, again, I'm making it louder. Is it good to specialize in low-skill production? And are there studies on the long-term consequences? It may be very bad to specialize in low-skill production and be stuck in something and do not leapfrog and so on. But I don't think there are no studies on this, because it's the difficulty with us economists. We are studying stuff that we can measure. It's not nice. But because we need causal identification. We want to get to an effect which is causal. So in a sense, if you want to if you want to measure this effect over a very long time period, it's getting harder and harder to attribute the effect to trade. So basically, it may not even be our fault that we are not measuring it. It's an attribution problem. That when you are looking at very sudden shifts in a policy, you are being able to manage and attribute the effects of this sudden policy shift. If you are looking at what happened over 30 years' time and whether that was useful and specialization was harmful, beneficial, it's very hard to pinpoint, I think. But maybe we are going to develop in that direction as well. And my second, sorry, I'm going to let you speak in a second. The second point, of course, we also do, like, I was giving you just a snapshot of a very tiny slice of the literature. Of course, we do observe technological upgrading. all the time. And trade is related to technological upgrading. So when you are opening up to trade, actually you may invite your firms to become more efficient over time, to upgrade technology, to switch. By now, China is also moving out of the super labor-intensive production, and there is a lot of skill upgrading going on. So there is also a natural process that may be working that may be inhibited if you just shut down shop. And shutting down shop may be very costly because of political economy reasons, because if you protect your industries very strongly, you make particular interests thrive, you make corruption rife. Some people are going to benefit, but it's just very, very specific people who are going to benefit. So in a sense, competition may also be good to the development of industries in a country. But that's just, so it's not coming from this literature, what I'm just saying right now, but rather it's a bit in a broader context that protectionism very often has the cost of keeping extremely inefficient firms afloat, diverting resources towards firms owned by the family. By the family, I mean by the ruling family or by the elite, by the powers to be, and that can be also very costly from a development perspective. But as long as you don't have the political economy in your mind and you don't look at it, so as long as you just look from a welfare perspective, you may not see those things.
Coming back to China.
Fine, let's come back to China. It's okay.
It's the fact that since they kind of they were not easy to boss around about accepting liberalization, let's put it this way. And
They liberalized big time. So it's okay. So sorry. There are so many ways to view the world, and you say China was not so easy to boss around by liberalization, and that's true. IMF was not pushing through any package in China. You are absolutely right, but China still opened up its markets very big time, and went a very big step from being a completely planned and absolutely closed economy to being a quite open and quite capitalistic-like system in many respects.
talking more about relatively, yes, but they still kind of kept more tariff than other countries. And
I'm not so good at. So you say China was able to keep more protection. So by entering the WTO, I'm not so good at Chinese tariffs because I've never looked at them. So in a sense, sorry, I may just not say anything meaningful. But they did have to reduce tariffs very big time. So I don't know how does the average Chinese tariff level compare to the Indonesian one. And by now, ASEAN, that's the big thing in Indonesia at least, ASEAN is forcing them to reduce non-tariff barriers as well. So by now they are absolutely, not by now, but last year, but last time spoke to some people, everyone was looking for the next NTB that no one knows about yet. So the next thing that they could somehow still use to micromanage and protect their firms without this being prohibited. And by now with ASEAN, there are just not so many opportunities anymore. I managed to wear you out, no.
So,
Okay.
First off, I was just wondering how you measure poverty in your studies, and then how, like, the theory of comparative advantage tells us that you catch up with the already developed countries, but the very that there are distributional effects, but on the end, due to if you account for the distributional effects, you would catch up somehow. But if we compare, say, Brazil to Asian countries, you would still say that Brazil has more welfare, maybe, or there's more. So my basic question is: would that trade lead to equalized, more equal world system, or would we still? So it's very vague, actually. But
Okay. question is, does trade lead to income equalization? I think we shouldn't overstretch the argument of comparative advantage. At least that's my feeling about it. It's just one mechanism among many. So in a sense, there are so many additional things that are affecting the worldwide distribution of income. So technological change, very important. It was very hard, also for empiricists, very hard to tell those apart. So for 20 years there has been a debate how much of changes in wage inequality in the US is actually due to trade and how much is due to the technology. And so technological change is a second component that's very hard to take it away from. So even if there was some equalization going on and at the same time technological change is progressing unequally, you are going to see a different type of outcome. Additionally, if there are also arguments even in this trade type of environment that just do not have to do so much with comparative advantage. So then you go to new economic geography and you go to agglomeration type of effects, which offer you a completely different development trajectory, where there is extreme solutions. So if there are increasing returns to scale and benefits, external returns to scale, so basically benefits to being close to other producers, there is going to be potential extreme concentration of certain types of production. So there are also other types of arguments that do not go along the comparative advantage dimensions. So I think the idea of comparative advantage is useful when you are thinking about distributional issues, but I don't think it's at all the only one that would affect outcomes. So if you really look at real world outcomes and then say, okay, but Brazil is different than another, or the experience of Brazil is different than another country, then there is a different policy environment, so different institutional environment, different, the way technological upgrading is working is affecting economies is also different. So there are so many additional factors. I would find it very hard to make such a comparison across countries and say, okay, so actually this convergence is due to trade. That's a very aggregated and a very macro type of question. I think it's a very interesting question. You are right, but more micro type of questions are easier to pinpoint, I think. So the more specific is the thing you are looking at, the easier your life, because then you are really being able to pinpoint some mechanisms. The broader the questions, and I think you are doing this here in this lecture series in a sense, you are also asking broad questions. You still allowed me to come and to talk to you, although I'm doing something super technocratic. The broader the questions, the less clear the answers become, would be my expectation. So, which is not because we do not want to give answers, it's rather our relative ability to give satisfactory answers to different types of questions. Sorry. Okay. So you had this is still the question. How do you measure poverty? So what you need in order to be able to measure poverty, you need information on what do people consume. So basically, you need household surveys that give you some consumption information, and additionally, you need some information on what level of consumption is needed to reach a poverty line. So basically, what we used is regional levels of or regionalized poverty lines that Indonesia has a national poverty line, but we were recalculating at a regional level because since regional prices are different, to be able to buy the same consumption basket costs you differently. So we were taking regional poverty lines and we were comparing individual consumption, the value of per capita consumption in a household, to a regional poverty line. And then poverty is being measured as, there are different ways to measure it, as the share of people who do not reach the poverty line. That's the first measure. The second is the income gap that people would have to bridge in order to reach the poverty line. So you take the poorest, second poorest, third poorest, and so on, and have a look at how much less do they consume as a total as compared to the poverty line, and you normalize it by how much everyone would need to reach the poverty line. So it's a share, basically. It's a gap. How much does it? How much consumption isn't being generated in the local economy? And then there is even a squared poverty gap, which is when you are squaring these distances and summing them up, then you are giving a larger weight to large deviations. So then you say, okay, very large deviations from the poverty line are penalized very strongly. It's like the OLS, in a sense, that you're penalizing deviations. That's usually how poverty is measured. So poverty is measured based on a local concept of poverty, and usually you need a line. So you need, since still a number, you need a consumption basket. So in a sense, that's really just how you put a number on a much more complex concept. You could always say, okay, poverty is just so much more than the distance to a poverty line. And you are, of course, right, but there are so many dimensions of poverty that we cannot meaningfully measure that actually distance to the poverty line is something that is being used very strongly in the literature. You had a question?
You talked a lot about the effects of the liberalization of the markets in developing countries.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit about what effects foreign direct investment would have on the market itself and the economy and the people, for example? Is there a correlation between the liberalization of the markets?
There is. So there is a correlation between liberalization. So again, it's for me, it's easier to answer the question on average, what does foreign direct investment do to the poor? I don't know that much yet. So there may be a literature on it. It's not a very large literature. I would be interested in that as well. So maybe even for future research projects, connecting local labor market effects actually to FDI. The difficulty is FDI is endogenous, not like a tariff cut. So again, it's much harder to measure, but it's an interesting question. It's basically a question about local multipliers. So it's a macro type of question, how much additional demand does foreign direct investment generate? And your expectation would be, if your expectation is foreign direct investment is increasing productivity, is enhancing efficiency, if that's what is happening, if there is some technological spillover going on, then you would be able to measure positive effects. And I think the effects on poverty could be really the secondary, tertiary effects where it's really about a local demand multiplier that it could affect. What we see in our paper is that, for instance, input tariff liberalization was also related to FDI. It was inducing FDI. So those firms, or firms in those regions that were more affected by slashing input tariffs, were also importing more, obviously exporting more, and receiving more FDI. So it's when you are opening up markets, many things come. But in this case, FDI may follow, actually.
But isn't it then the centralization on the most productive and efficient and
that's also
highly demanded goods that are produced by the sectors of corporations, basically, in the emerging markets? And won't this lead to less competition on the other side?
it's the question. Okay, the question is also about the scale. So that's also what the Vietnam study has, for instance, shown. If the scale is home production, then actually going towards firms may be beneficial because home production may be just way below any efficient scale. So maybe, sure, I understand that. So basically what you say, if there is a monopoly power being generated, then we start worrying, right? Because in itself, not FDI is a problem. The lack of competition may be a problem. So if you think about this, what's the issue? The issue would be, again, monopsony power being generated instead of just foreigners coming in. So it really depends on how the market structure looks like and what is happening and what is going on at that level. And I think you're absolutely right, but there is no reason to expect that without foreigners there is no monopoly power. Monopoly power could come from different directions. So in Indonesia, it was the Suharto family, and certain sectors were just in the hands of the family, which they are not foreigners. At the same time, there is a very large inefficiency through that as well. So I think it really depends on how the market is organized and depends on market structure. And you would have to look at that, that's true. But I don't have a general answer to this, like, especially not an ethical answer to this. I think it really depends on what exactly happens. And usually FDI is really just a tiny share of the local, or I have Indonesia in mind, but it's a tiny share of the local market, at least until now. So it's not like very large parts of the economy are being bought up by foreigners. It may be different in different contexts. So I think, in a sense, that's what an empiricist would always tell you. It's so context dependent, because I think it is.
Right.
Thank you very much for staying up.
Yeah, so thanks again. Thanks, Krisztina Kis-Katos. Thanks to all those who are still on their seats. There's a little present, some
Wow.
donation in your name and some
Thank you.
Bayreuth specialties. And yeah, thanks again. We hope we will see you again in 2 weeks. Yeah, next week there's a break with Daryl Mondorf. And yeah, have a nice evening. Thank you.